I'm Linda Green, and tonight, here at the Westford Historical Society and Museum, we are taking a radical departure from the written word and works of history to a time when storytelling was popular. Storytelling describes the social and cultural activities of sharing stories, sometimes with improvisation, theatrics, or embellishment. Every culture has its own stories or narratives, which are shared as a means of entertainment, education, cultural preservation, or instilling moral values. Our storyteller this evening is Abner Serd. Abner has a gift for bringing history to life. He comes to us fresh off an extended storytelling tour of New Zealand, where he entertained a wide variety of audiences with his recitation of classic 19th century poetry. Prior to that, Abner performed as an historic interpreter at Boston's Old North Church. He loves rummaging through museum archives and pursuits of tales from long ago. But beware, as a humorist in the Mark Twain tradition, Abner has been known to stretch the truth from time to time. Join us now for Two Truths, One Lie, Three Fours, and help us separate fact from fiction.
Thank you. Thank you. By the way, that extended storytelling tour of New Zealand, really only one date. So, but that doesn't count as a lie because I didn't say it, she said it. So, well, let's see. What shall we talk about this evening? Does everybody know the story of Commodore Joel Abbott? No? Born in Westford, you know the story. Oh, I thought I saw his hand go up. Born in Westford, 1793, attended Westford Academy, Westford's most celebrated naval officer with 40 years of distinguished service and not one, but 2 destroyers named after him. Well, I bet you there's even a statue of Commodore Abbott on Westford Common, right? There's no statue. Big statue of Commodore. That's probably just an oversight. And just because there's no statue, that doesn't mean the rest of this story isn't true. Let's start here. June 18th, 1812, Congress officially declared war on Britain, beginning the War of 1812. That same day, 19-year-old Joel Abbott joined the Navy. He served under Commodore McDonough, who was commanding the U.S. naval forces on Lake Champlain. And skipping forward a couple of years to September 1814, when the British Army and Navy were converging on the city of Plattsburgh, Commodore McDonough turned to Midshipman Abbott and famously said, "Are you willing to die for your country?" To which 21-year-old Joel Abbott famously replied, "Certainly, sir. That is what I entered the service for." He was given the task of destroying a supply of British masts and spars. Now, it was a dangerous mission behind enemy lines, and to get through the sentries, he disguised himself as a British soldier. And we all know what that means, right? It means he could have been hanged as a spy if he got caught. Now, as far as I know, the mission reports are still classified, so we don't really know exactly what happened that night. So we just have to imagine Joel Abbott sneaking through the lines on a dark, moonless night, the air thick with dew, his hands shaking so much he can barely light the explosives. And we have to imagine a shout of alarm, a fiery explosion, and the crack of rifle shots as Joel Abbott stumbles away through the night, badly wounded. We have to imagine that because nobody bothered to write down the details. But we do know this. For outstanding bravery in the successful completion of his mission that night, Joel Abbott was awarded a lieutenant's commission and a Sword of Honor from Congress. What a glorious way to start your military career, right? And that was just the beginning. 4 years later, the war was over, and the Navy was put to work chasing down pirates off the coast of Africa. How many of you have seen the movie Master and Commander? Pretty much everybody. Well, if you haven't seen it, I don't want to spoil the movie for you, but the simple fact is this. If an enemy ship is defeated, well, you've got three choices. You can sink her, you can burn her, or you can take her as a prize. If you take her, then that means somebody, some junior officer, has got to board that vessel and take command of her and sail her back to a friendly port. And that's how Lieutenant Abbott got his first command. It was a 30-gun pirate vessel. I think it was called the Marietta, but I'm not 100% sure of that particular fact. And Joel Abbott's orders were to sail the ship and its pirate prisoners back to Boston. Now, that seems pretty simple, right? It shouldn't have been any trouble at all. But as they were crossing the Atlantic Ocean, they ran into this terrible gale. And the ship was being tossed around, and part of the crew mutinied. Then the prisoners broke free. Now, once again, you just have to imagine this. A desperate melee in the middle of a howling North Atlantic hurricane with pirates and mutineers fighting for their very lives. A less disciplined officer might have lost control of the situation, but not Joel Abbott. He rallied the loyal crew members, and together they retook command of the ship and put the pirates back in irons and sailed that ship all the way back to Boston. And the next 30 years were pretty uneventful. No, I'm just kidding. A lot happens over the course of 30 years, but the fact remains that it's awfully hard for a young officer to make a name for himself during peacetime. So it says a lot about Joel Abbott's character that he kept on rising through the ranks, from lieutenant to commander to captain and eventually to commodore. He was an exemplary naval officer, renowned for his bravery, leadership, and military discipline. Exactly what you'd expect from a graduate of Westford Academy, right? Except that there seems to be some question as to whether or not he actually graduated. You see, the preceptor at the time was a man by the name of Mr. Nahum Gross. And according to school records, Mr. Gross excluded Joel Abbott from the academy for neglecting to attend meeting during a fast day. Now, what could be more important than attending meeting, right? Well, according to the official record, Joel Abbott chose to spend the day instead leading a company of young people in military drills on Westford Common. Among other things, the company could be heard firing a blunderbuss not once, but several times. Though in their defense, they did wait until the meeting was over before firing. Joel went so far as to enter the meeting house in what Mr. Gross called an improper costume, being partly military. And I'm going to quote the rest of this, what Mr. Gross said. He entered the meeting house in an improper costume, being partly military, uttering language calculated to introduce confusion and disorder into the school and bring the government thereof into contempt, refusing to make any written acknowledgement as to the impropriety of his conduct. Now, does that sound like a future naval officer, renowned for his military discipline? Maybe yes, maybe no. If you want to know for sure, the answers can be found right here in this building. Thank you. Does everybody here remember life before the internet? Yeah. Everybody knows what young people used to do for fun back in the days before cell phones and social media. What about television? Can anybody here remember the first TV their family ever bought? Couple of folks, okay. What about the first radio? No. Most of us can only imagine what it must have been like to grow up here in Westford before anybody even had electricity. But fortunately, we don't have to imagine because we have the recollections of a man by the name of Mr. George Perkins, who was born in 1899 and who lived in Westford from the time he was 2 months old. Back in those days, you lit your house with candles unless you could afford oil lamps. If you were really rich, you'd have gas lamps. But of course, oil and gas back then could only be used for lighting. You couldn't heat your house with it or anything like that. Most people didn't even have indoor plumbing back then. In matter of fact, George Perkins remembered tipping over outhouses in Forge Village as a 4th of July prank. You see, what you do is you take a rope about an inch thick and 100 feet long or so, and you'd have 10 or 20 boys on each end of the rope. And then you grab the outhouse and you just drag it over and run to the next one and drag that over. You could clear the whole neighborhood in a single night using this method. And 4th of July was the time for pulling pranks and capers like that. 4th of July back then was kind of like April Fool's Day and Halloween all rolled into one. And everybody knows the story about the cannonballs, right? Yeah? The young folks used to take the cannonballs and roll them down Prospect Hill. You know what they used to do with people's horses? They used to switch them around. They'd take the good horses from Spalding's stable and replace them with old nags from down on the poor farm. And boy, didn't that cause some dreadful rows the next day with Mr. Miller, the blacksmith, trying to sort out which horse belonged to whom. But the one thing that you had to do every year, and you had to do it at midnight on the night before the 4th of July, is you had to ring the bell at First Parish United Church. And it didn't matter if there were police sitting on the front stoop of the church. You had to find a way to get up into that steeple and ring that bell. Anybody have any ideas how you might do that? What's that? Go through a window, yeah, but the police might spot you if your tail end is still hanging out there. You might try a ladder, but the police are going to spot a ladder leaning up against the church too. There you go, now you're getting close. You know, there's a lightning rod that goes all the way up to the top of the steeple. So that's what George Perkins did. He shimmied up the lightning rod. Had the whole town scratching their heads as to how he got up there. I think it's safe to say that George was a bit of a daredevil when he was younger. For example, you know the water tower on Prospect Hill? Am I pointing the right way? I think it's over that way. Okay. Some people call it a standpipe. But anyway, George Perkins remembered climbing that tower in 1914 and getting all the way up to the top and sitting on the edge, 90 feet above the ground, with his legs dangling over the side. Anybody know anything about 1914? What else was happening? World War, yeah, but even closer to home, that was the year of the Great Salem Fire. And George Perkins remembered seeing that all happening from the top of that standpipe, even though Salem is all of 30 miles away. But that's not the most daringest thing that George Perkins and his friends used to do. Y'all know the windmill on Main Street? Yeah? Well, the one that's up there right now, as I understand it, isn't the original one. The original one was torn down long ago, and this has only been there for about 10 years or so. But the real story is why the original one was torn down in the first place. Anybody know that story? No? Well, you see, George Perkins was friends with Fletcher Abbott, whose father owned the windmill. And one summer day, George and Fletcher and 4 or 5 other young boys were playing Stump the Leader. And George was the leader, which meant that all the other boys had to do everything that he did. So what do you think George did? Well, he led those boys all the way up to the top of that windmill, and you know that arm that sticks out to one side? Well, Mr. Abbott came home one day to see George and his son Fletcher hanging off the end of that arm 60 feet above the ground. Boy, didn't they both get a paddling for that little adventure. And Mr. Abbott, he swore those boys would never go up into that windmill again, and to make good on his word, he had it torn down the very next day. So if any of you are looking to get into a little bit of mischief later on tonight, you might try following in George's footsteps. Just don't tell anybody where you got the idea. And if you're wondering whether this story is true or not, well, the answers can be found right here in the Westford Museum. Thank you. Well, seeing as how it's almost Halloween, it just seemed like the perfect time of year to tell this next tale. First of all, how many of you grew up here in Westford? Nobody grew up here? Okay, well then I can just say anything I want. This story, if you grew up here in the 50s and 60s, you might have already heard about the Howard House, which it's not there anymore. It was torn down in the 1960s. But for more than 100 years before that, it just sat there out on the end of Howard Road in Forge Village. And it was an old farmhouse. And it had 2 fireplaces, one on either side of the house. And so the chimneys stuck up through the roof like devil's horns. And it was surrounded by cornfields. And there were pheasants hiding in the cornfields. And at night, those pheasants would make a racket like bloody murder. And it was a creepy old house, and everybody knew it was haunted, which is probably why it stood abandoned so long after Alice Howard died in 1952. Alice was the last of the Howard clan to live in the old homestead. And when she was younger, she'd gone off to Simmons College and got herself a library degree, and everybody thought she'd just go off to the big city and get a job. But instead, she came back home to help her brother John on the farm. Big mistake for Alice. I mean, John was a good farmer, but he had a temper. And he used to ride his brother and sister something awful. He wouldn't let any of them leave the farm. He said it's a family business, and it takes the whole family to make it run. Some people say he tricked Alice into coming home, and then he just gradually stole her future away. Anyway, it was John's brother Thomas who found him dead in the field that frosty fall morning. It looked like he'd been run over by his own plow. It wasn't much of an improvement because Thomas was just as bad as John was. I mean, they had 2 other sisters. One of them got a job in Boston and moved away. The other one got married and she moved away too. But Thomas never let Alice go anywhere. And a lot of folks talked about that. And a rumor started going around that maybe John's death wasn't an accident after all. That maybe his brother killed him and Alice either knew about it or watched it happen. But the law could never really prove anything, so life just kept on going on. And Thomas died a few years after that. That was another kind of a freak accident. You see, he was in the barn and he must have tripped and stumbled or something because he cracked his head wide open. And there was blood everywhere. It was an awful sight. But what got everybody talking was the tattoo he had across his forehead. It was a pig tattoo. And I don't mean it was a picture of a pig. I mean it's the kind of tattoo that farmers use to identify which pigs are theirs. It's kind of like a brand, only it uses ink instead of hot iron. And see what it is, you've got this long-handled tool called a striker. And the striker has a steel plate on the end, and there are pins in that plate. And you can rearrange those pins so that the tattoo can spell out almost anything you want it to. And usually it's a serial number that identifies the pig and where it came from. But you can make it say whatever you want to. And then I guess the way it works is you just dip the pins in ink, and then you whack the striker against the shoulder of the pig, and it makes a nice, clear tattoo. Well, Thomas must have been fiddling around with this striker the night he died, because instead of spelling out the serial number of the farm and all, it had the date on it. It said OCT 261936. Now, that got people to talking in town something fierce. I mean, it's almighty unusual for a guy to die with the date of his death tattooed across the forehead like that. They figured what he must have done after he put the date on it, he hung it up on the rack above the the workbench there, and then when he fell, he must have hit the workbench, and it came down and whacked him right across the forehead. Anyway, folks kind of expected Alice to sell the farm and move away at that point, but she didn't. She held on to that farm right up until the day she died. And folks said she went a little bit crazy living all the way out there all by herself. She barely left the house after that. Anyway, it wasn't too long after Alice died that a young man by the name of Stuart Granger tried to spend the night in the old Howard house. Does anybody remember Stuart? No? So I guess if I tried to tell you he's got a statue of him on the common. Okay, that one's not going to fly. We'll just forget about that one. There's no statue. Well, see, he did it on a dare. And what he did is he climbed in a window that was broken around the back of the house. He didn't say how this window was broken, whether it was broken before he got there or maybe he did it, but we're not going to hold him for that just at the moment. Anyway, he snuck into this house. And he said there were books all over the place, wall to wall and floor to ceiling. And they were all neatly arranged by Dewey Decimal Classification System. And they even had date due slips in the back of the book on the inside back cover. Anyway, about 9 o'clock that evening, Stuart was in the kitchen fixing himself a sandwich when he saw the ghost of Alice Howard come through the door that led out towards the barn. And she was wearing this long flowing nightgown kind of thing that was white with red stains over the front. And she had this long-handled tool in her hand, and as she floated closer to Stuart, she raised up the striker, grinned at him, and said, "Are you ready to check out, my dear?" Well, he bolted out of that house so fast he left his sandwich sitting there on the kitchen table. And if you went up to that house even years after that and were brave enough to peek in the window, you would have seen that sandwich still sitting on the kitchen table untouched. And if any of you are doubting whether this story is true or not, well, just ask the folks here at the Westford Museum. I'm sure they can set you straight. Thank you.